Hello and welcome to this first webinar in our series for REACH 2018 registrants. My name is Adam Elwan and I will be your moderator for today's event. Now before we move on to the presentations, let me briefly remind you of why we're all here today. As many of you may know, the goal of REACH is to protect human health and the environment and to promote the use of alternative test methods for hazard assessment while maintaining the competitiveness of European industry and fostering innovation. One of the key elements needed to achieve this goal is to collect information on the chemicals used, manufactured, or imported in Europe. This is done through registration, where companies have to register their substances with us here at ECHA to inform us of their properties and measures taken to ensure their safe use. Registration started in 2010 for the most hazardous substances and the high-volume substances. The last registration deadline is on the 31st of May 2018 for substances manufactured or imported in quantities of 1 to 100 tons per year per company. As this deadline concerns lower tonnages, we expect that many small companies will be impacted with little or no experience of REACH. This webinar series is intended exactly for those of you that do not have previous experience with REACH. We'll guide you through the 7 different phases that lead you to a successful registration. Today's webinar aims to give first-time registrants an introduction into the startup activities that need to be done before moving on to the next phase, working with your co-registrants. Today's agenda should be visible on your screens. We'll start with a live demonstration of the REACH 2018 web pages, followed by 2 main presentations and a short video. The webinar will then conclude with a Q&A session. After the webinar, you will be able to start considering your portfolio of substances in REACH terms. You will have an understanding of how to accurately start identifying your substances and determine their composition and type. We will also help you to determine your registration obligations, understand your information needs, and start considering the impact registration will have on your business. So, let's move on to our first topic of the day, a live demonstration of the REACH 2018 web pages, focusing mainly on the first registration phase, which is the topic of today's webinar. These 2018 pages bring together all the guidance and support material that you will need when preparing your registration. They've been designed to give you an easily accessible, step-by-step approach with different levels of information depending on your needs and your expertise. All the information is also available in 23 languages. So please bear with me for just a moment while I share my screen with you. Okay, now you should all be able to see the ECHA homepage on your screens. First, you can find the pages by clicking on the REACH 2018 banner here. This takes you to the landing page for the REACH 2018 web pages, where you can identify your registration obligations. The page also provides useful support links where you can find more information. These are located here on the right side navigation, including the ECHA and National REACH help desks. In addition, you'll find sector-specific tools and guidance from our accredited stakeholder organizations, some specific information for SMEs, and for non-EU companies exporting their chemicals to the EU. The last 2 boxes on the page contain links to the latest news about REACH 2018 from ECHA, as well as a link to subscribe to our weekly e-news and stay up to date with the latest news, events, and developments from us. If you haven't already done so, I recommend signing up. To find if you have to register some of your chemicals, you can click on this link to take you to our stepwise approach pages that guide you through the registration process. On the left-hand side, you can see all the different phases involved, and you can use these links to navigate between them. The first phase is called Know Your Portfolio, and it is also the main topic of today's webinar. This phase is about understanding what registration obligations would mean to your company and making a sustainable plan for carrying out those obligations in time. An important thing to mention is that our support material on all these pages is structured with 3 levels of information. First, under Getting Started, you'll find basic information that will help you to start a specific phase. Second, under Essential Reading, you can find more in-depth information about each phase, which all REACH managers and companies should read before moving forward. Thirdly, the Going Deeper section gives links to information that is intended for those actually implementing the changes in your company. This includes practical guides and our more detailed guidance documents. Now, if you would like to access these pages in another language, you can do so from the drop-down menu here. Okay, moving on to the second phase, finding your co-registrants. You can see that the page follows the same structure as the previous one. This is the same for all 7 phases. I will now hand over the floor to my colleagues Catherine and Javier. Catherine will talk to you about knowing your substances and identifying your registration obligations. Javier, on the other hand, will help you to understand what information you need to collect for registration and how to assess the impact it will have on your business. Catherine, the floor is yours.
Welcome everybody to this webinar. My name is Catherine Cornu and I work on registration matters in ECHA. In this short presentation, I will set out phase 1 of our plan for a successful registration by 2018. Our plan has 7 phases in total, and phase 1 covers the startup activities you will do before you start working with other co-registrants. I will explain the basic principles here, but step-by-step instructions and guidance with examples are available on our website. So there are 5 key activities to start your registration. You need to know your portfolio, identify your substances, determine your registration obligations, understand the information you will need for registration, and consider the impact on your business. I will cover the first 3 activities in this presentation, and the last 2 will be covered in the next presentation. Let's now go through these activities one by one. The starting point for preparing to register is to know your portfolio in REACH terms, which substances you are dealing with. In some cases, this can be straightforward. For example, if you are manufacturing substances or importing substances on their own, you probably have your substance inventory already. But if you are dealing with products or mixtures like detergents or paints, you need to know or find out which substances they are made of, because it's the substances that you need to register and not the products. So substances on their own need to be registered, substances in mixtures, and also substances in articles that are meant to be released from the article. For example, a fragrance substance that is released from t-shirts. For each of the substances in your portfolio, you need to characterize and identify the substance. This means that you normally need to have a set of chemical analysis done, and based on that, with a chemist, determine the composition and type of the substance. And in particular, whether the substance is a monoconstituent substance, consisting mostly of one constituent, or if it's a multi-constituent substance, consisting of more than one constituent or compound, or it could also be a UVCB, which is a substance of unknown or variable composition, a complex reaction product, or a biological material. Based on the composition and type of substance, you need to determine the name of the substance, as explained in our guidance on substance identity, and then find the EC number and CAS number, or check is the EC number and CAS number you are using fits with the name and identity of the substance as it appears from the chemical analysis. It is important to identify your substance correctly, because later on you will need to discuss with your co-registrants if you have the same substance. And if you have the same substance, you will need to register jointly and ensure that the data in the joint registration is suitable for all the co-registrants. Then, once you know which are the substances in your portfolio, you can determine your registration obligations for each of them. To do this, there are 3 factors to consider, or 3 questions to ask. And if the answer is yes to all these 3 questions, you will have to register the substance. If the answer is no to one of these questions, you don't have to register. So what questions to ask? The first question is about your role in the supply chain, and it is, do you need to register the substance? To find the answer, it's important where you are located. If you are located in any of the countries in the European Economic Area, you may have to register. Those countries are shown here on the map in dark blue. We are basically talking about the 28 member states of the EU, plus Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. If you are located in any of the countries in light gray outside the European Economic Area, you cannot register. So if you are located in any of the countries in the European Economic Area, you may have to register, and it depends on your activity or your role in the supply chain whether you need to register or someone else does. To start with, you have to determine what exactly it is you do with the substance, and we have the definitions and criteria on our website. There are 4 roles in the supply chain that need to register. First is the manufacturer. If you manufacture or synthesize or extract a substance, you need to register it. The next role is importer into the European Economic Area, or only representative, which is a kind of importer appointed by a manufacturer outside of the European Economic Area. If you are responsible for the import of a substance into the European Economic Area, you need to register it. The 4th role is the producer or importer of an article from which a substance is released. If you have another role than these 4, for example, if you are only importing from within the European Economic Area or via an only representative, then you do not need to register. So your role in the supply chain is one factor to consider. Another factor to consider is the scope of reach and the exemptions from registration. The question to answer here is, does the substance need to be registered at all? And to answer this, you need to check the different exemptions. Some substances do not need to be registered, mostly because they are low risk, and you can find a complete list on our website. The list of exempted substances includes, for example, polymers and water. For polymers, you should be aware that you have to carefully check the criteria for what is a polymer, and if the substance is a polymer, then you need to register the monomers instead. In addition to substances that are exempted from registration, there are also uses of substances that are exempted, because they are adequately regulated under other legislations or other provisions under REACH. For example, if you are doing product development with a substance, or if you are using the substance in food, feeding stuff, or pharmaceuticals. If you use the substance only for the exempted use, you do not need to register. But if you or your downstream users have other uses for the substance, then you would need to register. A third category of exempted substances relates to specific conditions, such as re-imported substances that have already been registered, substances discarded as waste, or substances recovered from waste that have already been registered. And again, we have the definitions and criteria for these on our website. Then the third factor to consider next to your role and the substance itself is your volume. And the question to ask is, do you reach the 1 ton per year threshold? Because if you do not reach the 1 ton per year threshold for a substance, you do not need to register it. To calculate your volume, you base it on the calendar year from the 1st of January to the 31st of December. And if you manufactured or imported during the last 3 years before your registration, you calculate the average over those 3 years. When you are making your volume calculations, it's important to know that it's not only being above 1 ton per year that matters, but your volume will also determine how much information you will need to provide in your registration. So you should also determine if you are between 1 and 10 tons per year, between 10 and 100, between 100 and 1,000, or above 1,000. And another thing to be aware of is that if you use the substance also as an intermediate in the production of another substance under strictly controlled conditions, you can normally make separate volume calculations for this, and the information you will need to provide in your registration for that use is a lot less. So we've now looked at the 3 factors determining your registration obligations. If you find that you have the role to register the substance and that the substance needs to be registered and you reach the 1 ton per year threshold, then you need to register the substance. In looking at these 3 factors, you should start with the one that is most likely to give you a no rather than a yes. For example, if you are dealing with very small volumes, maybe you can do your volume calculations first, and if you find that no, you do not reach the threshold, then you don't need to look into your role and your substance to determine that you do not need to register. So we've now talked about the first 3 key activities of phase 1 of your plan for registering by 2018, and I will conclude with a few messages for you to take away from this. The first one is to start now, if you've not done so already, with going through your portfolio and determining which substances you have in your portfolio. Those substances need to be analyzed and identified, and if you need help with that, it is important that you plan and book your chemical analysis soon, so you know the identity of your substances by the time you start talking with your co-registrants. Remember the 3 factors that determine your registration obligations: your role in the supply chain, the substance, and the 1 ton threshold, and consider these in parallel with going through your portfolio and analyzing your substances. Also know that you can check on the ECHA website if a substance has been registered already, and which name or identifiers other companies used for a substance. You can search for a substance from the top right-hand corner of the ECHA main page. And while you're on our website, you can also look at our support material for phase 1, which is also available from the ECHA main page by clicking on the Reach 2018 banner.
Hello everyone, my name is Javier Sanchez and I work as my colleague Catherine, who delivered the previous presentation with registration matters here at the European Chemicals Agency. In our previous presentation, my colleague Catherine introduced the first key activities to get started with your registration. I will now cover points 4 and 5 as indicated in this slide. With this, I aim to provide you with a high-level overview to help you understand which information you need to collect in order to register your substances and what you should consider when assessing the impact to your business. But remember that further information and guidance is available on our website. You simply need to follow the Reach 2018 banner. But let's start first by very briefly outlining the basic principles for registration of substances under the REACH regulation. Registration is nothing but your opportunity to document your responsibility for the safe manufacture and use of your substances. This is achieved by performing a series of steps. First, collecting all the relevant information on your substances and generating new information when needed. Secondly, assessing the risks for workers, consumers, and the environment. Then, developing and recommending measures to manage the risks. And lastly, but very importantly, communicating those measures through the supply chain, again, to prevent adverse effects on human health and the environment. Finally, you need to include all this information in your registration dossier and send it to us, to the European Chemicals Agency. This is ultimately the proof that you meet your responsibilities. In the following 3 slides, I aim to give you a first flavor of the information you need to collect or generate for your registration. In general, you need to collect all physicochemical, toxicological and ecotoxicological information that is relevant and available to you. But the REACH regulation sets a minimum of information to be provided. This minimum is what I will present here in a very schematic form. At this point, and before I go to the information requirements, I would like to mention that reduced requirements apply in case that you manufacture isolated intermediates under strictly controlled conditions. The information I'm about to provide corresponds to the standard requirements. Good to keep in mind. In this slide here, you have a summary of information you always need to provide, irrespective of the tonnage you manufacture or import. First, you always need to provide sufficient information to identify clearly your substance. This includes the UPAC name, EC number, CAS number, and other identifiers. But it always needs to be justified by analytical information, which has to be included in your registration. You then need to provide information on manufacture, use, and exposure. This includes quantities in tons per year, and importantly, a description of each one of the uses of your substance. This description of the uses need to cover the whole life cycle of your substance, from manufacture to waste. This requires communication with your customers to identify all the relevant users. Then you need to collect a set of information on the physicochemical properties. These include, among others, the boiling point, the vapor pressure, and so on. And finally, you need to include also the classification and labeling of your substance. In certain situations, this might actually be all the information you need. However, there are conditions to be able to rely on these reduced requirements. In general terms, this is the case if your tonnage stays below 10 tons a year, and you can justify that your substance is not hazardous and is not used in a dispersive way, particularly not included in consumer products. If you cannot properly justify these conditions, you need an additional set of information. And this is what we have in the next slide. This additional set of information is the standard requirement for registration of a substance in quantities below 10 tons a year. On top of what was mentioned in the previous slide, you need information on the toxicological and ecotoxicological properties of your substance. You can see in the slide a few examples of such studies, but please visit our website to obtain the full picture with all the studies which are required. In case your tonnage goes beyond 10 tons a year, additional studies are needed for both toxicological and ecotoxicological properties. Again, you can find a few examples of such studies in this slide. Importantly, at this tonnage level, you also need to perform a full chemical safety assessment, which is to be documented in a chemical safety report in your registration. The chemical safety assessment needs to include a hazard assessment on human health and environment, and in case the substance meets the criteria for being assessed as hazardous, you also need to include an exposure assessment and a risk characterization. This process needs to be repeated by reassessing the hazard information or revising the operational conditions and the risk management measures until you can conclude that the risks are controlled. This work requires specific expertise. I only explain here the requirements for tonnages up to 100 tons a year, since they are the ones impacted by the 2018 deadline. In case you go beyond 100 tons per year or even 1,000 tons per year, additional information is needed. So again, please go to our website to see the full information. We have seen in the previous 3 slides high-level overview of the minimum information that you need in order to register your substances. However, before generating new data, I would like to remind you of a series of basic steps. First of all, you need to collect all available existing information. You then need to share all the information you have with other companies, in particular with those companies needing to register the same substance. Keep in mind that all the information on the properties of the substance needs to be submitted jointly by all the companies dealing with the same substance. Once you have a good overview of all the information at hand, your next step as a group is comparing it with the information you need in order to register the substance. Through that exercise, you will identify the gaps in your information, which you need to fill in through generating new data. However, before conducting new tests on vertebrate animals, you need to consider all alternatives. Remember that tests on animals are the last resort when all other data sources have been exhausted. Once Gabe briefly gone through the information you need to provide in your registration, let me highlight in a couple of minutes some key areas you might want to consider when assessing the impact to your business. As we saw in previous slides, registering your substance will require investing on compiling and assessing information. Importantly, this activity will need to take place at two different levels: within your own company, but also with other companies manufacturing or importing the same substances. In other words, you will need to work with your competitors. This means you need to invest resources on a series of areas. First, in collecting and evaluating all available information within your company, including literature searches, and obtaining information on different uses of your substance by your customers down the supply chain. Consider whether you have the required expertise in your organization or whether you need to outsource this task. Then, in case there are other companies going for registration of the same substance, you will need to establish contractual arrangements to work together and eventually agree on how to generate any missing information and share the costs. If you are the only company with an interest in registering the substance, you obviously don't need to go through the step of agreeing and negotiating. But the important drawback here is that you will then need to generate and put together all the information on your own. Finally, experience from companies which have already registered the substances shows that good planning is essential to meet the deadline. Consider involving early enough other departments within your company, which will certainly have a role to play. Depending on the number of substances you need to register by 2018, you might want to prioritize one of them to go from start to end in order to learn the whole process. I will also advise you to get to know the IT tools for registration, in particular Euclid for compiling all the information on your registration, and ReachIT for sending the file and receiving any communication from us. We are working on new, simplified versions of both tools, which will be released in mid-2016. Therefore, if you have not used them yet, you might want to wait for these new versions. Remember that the information you are putting together will evolve with time, and you will need to keep it up to date in your registration. Therefore, consider keeping a certain level of resources for this. The final slide includes my key messages from this presentation. Firstly, as mentioned at the beginning, consider registration as your opportunity to document the safe use of your substance. You need to identify all your substances within your chemicals portfolio and collect all the information now. There is not a lot of time for the final registration deadline in 2018. This includes communication with your customers to get information on how the substance is used. Then, you also need to establish a project plan to register all your substances on time. Consider the expertise you have in your company and whether you need to outsource part of the work to a consultant. Finally, you can consult our new support pages specifically developed in view of the 2018 deadline. Simply follow the Reach 2018 banner. In case you need any further support, you can consult your national help desk or the European Chemicals Agency at any time. Thank you very much for your attention.
If you have any questions related to Catherine's and Javier's presentations, you're welcome to send them using the Q&A panel visible in your webinar window. As mentioned before, we'll answer as many of them as possible directly through the Q&A panel. Don't forget that if your question is not covered by the end of the webinar, you can always submit it to your national help desk or to the ECHA help desk. Okay, now it's time to watch a short video recorded during our Stakeholders Day conference earlier this year. It has several short interviews with companies who are also preparing for REACH 2018. We thought it would be a good idea to ask them to share their best practice with you and give some tips that can help you in your work.
My first advice is starting directly.
Start immediately.
I suppose to start in time, because it takes time to organize everything, not to leave it to the last minute.
Biggest advice is what's been said here a few times: start early.
Well, first of all, you could employ a consultant to give you some guidance.
The first one is not to be scared.
It seems to be a long time to 2018, but it takes a long time to prepare dossiers, especially for companies starting with this issue.
For the first time, if they register, then I would suggest they contact somebody that's done it before. They contact a consultancy, or then they hire people into their own company that have done this before.
There's not a lot of consultants out there. There's not a lot of test houses that are geared up to do this. They're all going to get very busy, and if you don't start now, you could find yourself in a few years' time where you're desperate to do a registration, and the backup that you need is just not there because there physically is not the capacity.
The key point is to start looking at the general class of substance that you have.
To study the REACH regulation, the relevant guidelines, to assess the REACH IT portal, the ICA website, and so on.
Try to get the basic idea of the substance and then tailor an appropriate analytics package involving the correct analytics techniques for that type of substance.
You need to know today what your substance is. Plan time for substance identification, and then you need to agree in the SIF on who's going forward with doing the relevant testing, and then the relevant testing will take some time as well.
You can spend millions doing it, but there still isn't the capacity to do it, so money will not solve the problem. It's time.
If you don't have all the people who know all the toxicological things and ecotoxicological, is to hire a good consultant.
You can rely on external consultants, on the SIF itself, on the lead registrant, or on the secretariat of a SIF.
The SIF work is as the speakers here today has mentioned, essential to participate in and participate early in.
You may find that actually your substance is not the same as the partner's company substance, and there are two registrations, or maybe if you're lucky, you can cover your substance with an already existing registration.
Remember that many aspects of analytics are confidential, but trade associations often know how to bring these together in a non-confidential way.
Mainly for the small companies, it's no use to learn everything yourselves. So it's better to use people that know what they are doing.
So really, start today. It's at the edge of being late.
Probably the most difficult point for importers, they do not have direct access to the data. So they may have to start doing much of the work themselves. One main difficulty importers face, they can have multiple suppliers. So therefore, in those cases, they need to make sure that their single registration, their importer registration, covers all of their sources. In those situations, probably the best route is to simply push your suppliers. Push your suppliers for more information so they can push up the chain to their suppliers, and give them some clear warning that without an appropriate registration in Europe, there is no business.
From our experience, it took from 3 months to 6 months as an average, or 1 year. 1 year was the highest one.
If you are the only one registering, then it can take a year or two to do it, if you have to do everything yourself. But if you join a joint submission, then it depends on how fast you actually can get the substance identity done for you.
If you're really starting from so that you find out that oh, accidentally we have this substance that we haven't even recognized that it exists, and then you find out, for example, that it might be a non-phasing thing or something like that, and then you start working up. I think, well, it's of course depending on the tonnage band as well, but it takes years in that case.
We say about 20 to 50,000 euros for the smaller volumes and about 100,000 euros for the bigger ones.
You could be looking at 10,000 euro for a fairly simple case, maybe up to 20 for something more complex.
I think for substances between 1 and 100 tons, the main costs are the administrative costs. Because for 1 to 10 tons, you don't need a lot of testing. We talk about 30,000 euros for testing for these substances. But you have to go to other companies, you have to go to meetings, you have to organize it. For smaller companies, you have to hire a consultancy.
For 1 to 10 tons, I would assume that for a simple substance, that is to say, which is not listed in the Annex 14, one SME, probably for one SME the cost would be around altogether, let's say 3,000 euro.
So for our company, I would say the main cost is the administrative work, the internal costs. So the registrations fee for intermediates it's quite low, though. That's not a problem. But to look for all the informations in the company, that's much makes the experience.
The main costs are indirect costs. At the first glance, it could sound that you look at 25,000 euros, 30,000 euros for a registration, and you would consider that this is the main cost. But if you stop and think, and you are skilled with reach, you know that this money you maybe will recover after that other members enter the same consortium, letter of access, so you will be reimbursed, so you will gain back some of this money.
Well, it all depends on the amount of participants in the consortium, because the fees can be from 5,000 euros per substance to 200,000 per substance.
For more than 1,000 tons, then it depends very much on what is required. It can be maybe an additional 5,000, but it can be also an additional 100,000, depending on the substance.
Okay, now it's time for a question and answer session. I'm joined here by my panelists. We've got Gabi from the Substance ID team. She's an expert in substance identity. Then we have Javier Sanchez and Kevin Pollard, who together with Catherine, who you saw presenting earlier, oversee the registration process. So let's move on to the questions. To start with, we've had a few let's say, complaints about bureaucracy and resistance as to why people should be registering. So could you give a bit of an overview as to what are the benefits of registration? Why should companies do it?
Well, I think it's important to remember, whilst the chemicals industry is very important to the European economy and to the European society, it does not come without certain risks. And it is known that there are chemicals which can be harmful to workers, to consumers, or to the environment. And 2018 registration is really about catching up on the substances that have been on the market for some time and asking the industry who are profiting from these substances to make the investment to prove that they're safe. So this is of course a major reason, and it's the reason that we're all here today. The registration dossier is a way for you to collect the necessary data, demonstrate that you have safe use in the supply chain, and then by submitting it to the authorities, allow an independent assessment of that to make sure that we have an even playing field. There are two more reasons for registering. One is that it allows ECHA to put certain information about the substances transparently available to the public. And this is a very important part of European policy these days. And the final reason is so that ECHA and the authorities can look at these databases and investigate any possible concerns about additional risks caused by the substances so that they could make risk management measures. So a whole suite of reasons, and concretely, if you want to stay on the market, you need to register.
Another burning question is time. I know that 2018 seems like a long way away, but a lot of what we've heard today has been saying to start now. One of the questions we've heard is, does it really take 2 years to register? So can you give a bit more advice on the timing that people should be reserving?
Yes, well, it depends actually on the specifics of the substance. As we heard in the interviews in the video from some of our stakeholders and companies who registered before, it very much depends on the situation you are in. In the case, let's say that the substance is already registered by other companies, it might take a few weeks or months just to put together the basic information, while if the substance has not been registered yet, and you need to actually start collecting all the data and assessing the risks and so on, it may take indeed, well, up to 2 or 3 years to put all that information together. So it very much depends on the situation. So the main message will be here, start analyzing where are you in, what's your situation, and start planning to make it on time.
Again, I'd just like to compliment a little bit Javi's answer. As you hear there, it really does depend. If you think about some of the key phases, so operating with other companies, other pre-registrants of your substance, essentially making contracts with your competitors, that can be complicated, that can take a lot of time, but it really depends on your business environment. As was mentioned, for the hazard data, if there are gaps, you're going to need to order tests, and it has been reminded also by our industry colleagues that there can be big queues to get hazard testing. So again, the main message here is do the research to understand your specific context based on what you've learned today, and then you can start to understand how long it would take you to register your substance. If you have multiple substances, you might find that some are on the shorter time frame and others on the longer time frame. So essentially you'll be doing some project planning. So again, it depends, and you're the ones who can begin to answer that question.
Okay, thanks. That covers the time aspect, but what about then in terms of financial resources? How much money do people need to invest into their registration?
Well, I think this was also covered to a certain extent in the video that we just saw. And again, depends on a series of factors. If the substance has been registered, well, it's basically the main financial cost is getting an agreement with the companies who've already registered on sharing the cost, and what's the share of the cost that the company needs to pay. But if the substance has not been registered yet and they need to generate data, well, they need to then factor in the costs for the lab tests, for the expertise to analyze all that data and put the information together and assess it. And also it will depend on the internal resources in a company they have. Do they have the experts in-house, or do they need to outsource it and hire a consultant, for instance? So based on that, there is, well, a wide range. It could be from a few thousand euros in case the substance is already registered and they just need to join that registration, or it can go to some hundreds of thousands of euros if there is the need of generating substantial new information.
Okay, well this takes me nicely actually to the next question, which is about substance identification. What kind of chemical analyses need to be done when identifying the substance? Gabi?
Well, the REACH regulation requires a set of analytical data. So you have spectral analysis and you have quantitative analysis. So here we are talking about, in general, UV visible or infrared or NMR or mass spectrometry. Or we want to quantify the substance, then we are usually talking about gas chromatography or HPLC.
Okay, and are the requirements for substance identification always the same?
Well, it depends on what type of substance you have. Some are more difficult, so you might need to add another analysis in order to be sure what the composition is. Or you might have inorganic materials, so then it might be better to use XRG or elemental analysis to quantify the substance.
Okay, thank you. What about importers then? If you're importing from outside the EU and only 2 of the 3 sources that you import from have appointed an only representative, what should they do in that case?
Okay, maybe I could take that one, Adam. Just to reflect the scenario. So I'm importing from 3 non-EU suppliers, and 2 of them have their own only representative, which is essentially a special kind of importer. For the third route, for the third supplier, you would either need to register yourself as an importer to maintain that supply chain, or encourage them to nominate their own only representative, or you will have to stop importing from that company.
Okay. What about in a case of metals? If someone is importing metals as a powder or solid blocks, does that affect their substance identification in some way?
Well, the good news here is that you register only once. So your metal, whether it's in a powder form or as a bulk material, it doesn't matter. The only difference, what it makes us probably that it might have different properties. So in that case, you have to give two compositions, one for the powder and one for the bulk material. Because this, depending on the hazard, you might need to classify the powder and the bulk material differently. And here again, you should also have two sections for the classification and labeling in section 2.1 of the Euclid dossier.
Okay. What about those who import articles? So for example, toys, do they need to register something?
Well, they need to register only under certain conditions. So basically, and I think it was covered in Catherine's presentation, only if the substance is intended to be released from the article. So for instance, if the toy has been designed to give certain smell, for instance, so in that case the substance is intended to be released and need to be registered if it's in a quantity over 1 ton. And the third condition is if the substance has not been registered before. So if those conditions are met, the substance is intended to be released, is over 1 ton, and has not been registered by anybody else, then it needs to be registered. Otherwise, it does not need to be registered.
Yeah, maybe I could give a couple of specific examples because it's not so clear sometimes. So essentially, we have a hierarchy here that the substances must be registered according to your role and the advice that we had earlier in the presentation. Substances in mixtures must always be registered according to the same criteria, and substances in articles only have to be registered, as Javier say, when they are, let's say, for intended release. So it's not always straightforward or obvious whether something is a mixture or an article. A good example is candles, which have a very clear physical form, but in fact under REACH are treated as mixtures. So for example, if you're importing candles, you need to understand the specific substances within those candles, the quantities, and make your registration plans accordingly. An example of an article with intended release would be, for example, a t-shirt with a fragrance that emits a fragrant aroma. So this maybe gives you a better idea, the distinction, mixture and article, and also the intended release. But again, worth checking out properly, and you can start doing that on our webpage.
Okay, what about byproducts? So for example, waste, does that need to be registered?
Well, at the high level, the essential deciding factor with recycling processes, waste management processes, if the output of a recycling process is considered as a new substance, then that would need to be registered because you're putting a new substance into the supply chain. If it's rather a recycling of the initial substance, then that would not need to be registered as part of the initial substance's supply chain.
Okay. Right. So, if a registrant has all the information they need, can they register on their own, or do they need to go as a part of a joint submission?
Well, the REACH regulation is very clear on that. So, the companies registering the same substance, they need to register it together. So that's basically because they need to share data on the substances. Is one of the main principles of REACH. So you cannot just simply go on your own. You need to get into discussions with the companies that are dealing also with the same substance, share the data, and build together the registration dossier and submit it jointly. There are certain situations where for a specific information in the dossier you can submit it on your own as an opt-out, but still you have to be as a whole part of the joint submission.
Okay, thank you. Now a more downstream user related question. So if a downstream user is worried that a substance critical for their business hasn't been registered, what should they do to get that substance registered?
Well, first my advice will be to get in touch with their suppliers and clarify the intentions, whether they are going to register or not. I mean, there is still 3 years for the 2018 deadline, so it might be that they have clear intentions of registering from now until 2018. So communication there is key. Ask them what are the intentions. If they the outcome is that the supplier decides that it's not worthy for them and they are not going to register, then is when these downstream users will start looking into alternatives, finding different suppliers, or eventually just becoming a registrant and register the substance themselves as an importer, for instance.
Thanks. We have a question about the EC and CAS number. So if you don't know the EC and CAS number for your substance, what should they do?
Well, not for every substance there is a CAS number available, and consequently maybe not an EC number either. So the REACH regulation says, like, if available, so like of course you have to search for it. Maybe the best start would be the EC inventory or the dissemination page. You might find even the substance there, and if you can't find it, then leave the field empty.
Okay.
I think just one thing I'd like to add to that, whilst there are plenty of contexts, for example, if you have a brand new substance, then it might not have an EC or a CAS number. At least for our main audience today, most likely if you're a pre-registrant, there would be an EC number for your substance, is hopefully the one that you use to pre-register. In case you find out that it's a different one, there are methods of adjusting your pre-registration and contacting the correct CIF. So again, it's very important to check based on your specific situation, and you could always, if you're unsure, bring a question to our national help desk or to the ECHA help desk.
What about the concentration of a substance? So if it varies for a substance, a specific substance, depending on the batch, what kind of information are you looking for?
Well, usually we are looking for the typical concentration, but also for the concentration ranges, so the lower and the upper value. Mm-hmm. And so if you do batch analysis, like for example every day, you take an average, this would be your typical concentration, and then like you take the lowest value you ever found for the lower concentration, and the upper value for the highest value you found.
Okay, thank you. Then another question on importing. This time, someone importing from Norway, do they need to register if they import from Norway? And as a follow-up, what if they import from Switzerland? So first Norway, do they need to register?
So for Norway, the simple answer is no.
Okay.
This was also part of the earlier presentation. So REACH has been implemented not only in the European Union, but also in the European Economic Area, which is a little bit broader and includes Norway. So if you're importing from Norway, that's essentially importing from within Europe, according to REACH, and does not need to be registered. Switzerland, on the other hand, is not a member of the European Economic Area, and as such must be regarded as a non-EU country, and you need to register.
Okay. To start concluding, we have a couple more questions. First, where do people find support on the ECHA website? That was one question that was asked. I know we've mentioned a few times, but maybe just to remind our participants where they can find all the support they need for registration.
Yes, so we've just actually now launched a new support material which is easily accessible through our REACH 2018 landing page. So my advice will be use that page. It's very clearly, we have the banner in our homepage about the REACH 2018, and then there we have made an effort of structuring the information in different levels of complexity. So starting from very basic information and then going deeper if needed. So I will really encourage everyone to check this material whenever they have questions and read it. And of course we are more than happy to improve them as much as needed. So they can also provide us feedback if they see they would like to see additional information that is not there, for instance.
Yeah, I'd really like to, thanks Javi, I'd really like to emphasize that we've designed these 2018 web pages as best we can to be a one-stop shop for people coming to registration for the first time. If you find something unclear or you find a gap, please do contact us and we will do our best to address it.
Okay, I'm conscious of time. Now, before we conclude, are there any take-home messages that you'd like to give before we stop the session?
Take-home messages. I think some things to keep in mind. Many companies have already registered. Thousands of companies have already successfully registered. That means that so can you. Network within your supply chain. Find an existing registrant. Learn from them, and make use of our tools. Is a key message, and then also, of course, keep in mind what you're achieving with registering, which is that the European Union can say that we have safe use of chemicals, and you can confirm to your supply chain that your chemicals are safe to humans and the environment.
Okay, that's about all the time we have for today. Thank you to our panelists and presenters, and most of all, thank you to all of you for joining us here today. Remember that you will be able to find a recording of the webinar and further support material on the REACH 2018 web pages. Our next webinar will be in November. The topic of the next webinar will be the second phase of the registration process, which is finding your co-registrants. We'll be covering topics such as finding the lead registrant, finding your co-registrants, getting active in the pre-CEIF, and the support we are providing you on these issues. So if you haven't already done so, remember to subscribe to our news either from the REACH 2018 webpage or directly from our ECHA homepage to stay up to date. So I hope you found the webinar useful. When we close the webinar, you will be automatically redirected to a short feedback questionnaire. Please do take the time to share your comments and your suggestions with us so that we can further develop our webinars to meet your needs. See you again in November.